The Sumerians and the New Year, Foundations of Memory ****. The Sumerians believed that clay remembers everything. While soft, it takes an impression. Once dried, it preserves it forever. That is why they chose clay over stone or papyrus. Clay was earth, and the earth was a witness to the gods. Thousands of tablets were inscribed over and over. Some recorded trade and debts, others the stars and time, and still others the gods. But when arranged not by topic but by chronology, a strange pattern emerges. The further from the era of living gods, the more cautious the writing becomes. Early texts speak confidently. Enki taught. Enlil commanded. The Anunnaki established. Later texts speak differently. So it was established in ancient times. Such is the ancient order. Thus the old tablets say. The source of knowledge changes. It ceases to be living. The Sumerians never wrote outright about prohibitions. They never said, "This must not be written." But the prohibition can be felt by how they wrote. Through circumlocutions. Through repetitions instead of explanations. Through places where the text seems to circle around the subject but never enters it. This is especially evident in texts related to the Anunnaki. Their names do not vanish immediately. They remain, like echoes. But the Anunnaki gradually transformed from active forces into abstract ancestors. Not those who rule, but those who once ruled. The Sumerians were careful with the past. For them, the past was not dead. It could intervene. Disturb the order. Therefore, they spoke of it cautiously. In the temples of Nippur were kept special tablets. They were not shown to everyone. They were not used to trained scribes. Only the senior priests knew of them. These tablets were never read aloud. They were read silently. They did not directly describe the departure of the gods. But there were strange things. Lists of rituals no longer performed. Addresses to gods who no longer responded. Descriptions of places no longer visited. And above all, pauses. In some texts, a sentence begins as if a great revelation should follow, and ends with a formula of respect. As if the scribe changed his mind. The Sumerians believed that knowledge could be dangerous. Not because it was false, but because it could disrupt balance. If the gods left for a reason that could not be corrected, then knowing that reason could destroy hope. And hope was necessary. Kings continued to rule, referring to the Anunnaki. Laws were still proclaimed as established by the gods. If it became known that the gods had left forever, the entire structure of the world would collapse. Therefore, history was softened. Not rewritten, softened. Sharp edges were smoothed. Direct statements replaced with tradition. The personal presence of the gods, by their names. The Sumerians did not lie. They were silent where the truth was too heavy. There are tablets that speak of times when the sky was closer. The phrasing is strange. It does not explain why the sky became farther. It simply notes the fact. Like someone saying, "The sea was closer to the house before," without explaining whether it receded or was pushed back. In these same texts appears a new phrase. Ancient decrees. Decisions made before human memory. Decisions that cannot be changed. This phrase is almost never accompanied by an explanation. As if the explanation existed, but was excluded. If you read the Sumerian text carefully, it becomes clear. They knew more than they wrote. Their writing is not just a story, but a filter. The Anunnaki did not disappear from texts. They disappeared from verbs. They were no longer attributed actions in the present tense. This is the trace of their departure. Not destruction. Not catastrophe. But a gradual transformation of living gods into memory. And when the last tablet was written, as if the Anunnaki were still watching. The Sumerians were already living in a world where the watchers no longer existed. But they were not yet ready to admit it. In the quiet of temples, old priests sometimes lingered over the space between the lines. They knew, it was there that what could not be carved in clay was hidden. And from there begins the next part of the story. The story of a city left without teachers, yet continuing to act as if they were still near. Part 2. Nippur awaits, the city without teachers ***. Nippur never truly slept. Even when the lights were extinguished and the streets emptied, the city continued to breathe. The rustle of the wind through reed doors, the creak of dried beams, the distant barking of dogs, all merged into a steady, almost lulling rhythm. But after the gods departed, a subtle pause appeared in that rhythm. Barely noticeable, yet unmistakable. Like a heartbeat skipped. Nippur was not just a city. It was considered the place where decisions of the heavens touched the earth. Here, kings did not rule. Here, the very possibility of authority was confirmed. And if the Anunnaki truly left the world, Nippur would feel it first. And so it did. The priests began to notice. The temple no longer responded as it once did. Rituals were performed with precision, words pronounced without error, sacrifices abundant, yet the sense of presence vanished. Not abruptly. Gradually. As if someone standing behind the door first stopped speaking, then breathing, and finally left without closing it. The most troubling aspect was not the absence of signs, but their uncertainty. Earlier, omens were clear. A king's dream had a definite meaning. The flight of a bird indicated a specific outcome. A crack in clay was read as a letter. Now everything became ambiguous. The same sign could signify different things. Priests argued. Old texts offered no answers. New ones did not appear. In Nippur, memories of the Golden Age began to surface more frequently. Not as legend, but as a reference point. In the conversations of elder priests, phrases began to recur. Enlil used to answer immediately. When the Anunnaki were here, there was no doubt. Doubt became the new state of the world. And at night, it was felt most strongly. The temple, bustling with movement and duties by day, became too vast, too empty at night. The echo of a priest's steps returned too quickly, as if the space itself was compressing. Some whispered that the gods had merely ascended higher, observing from afar. Others suggested the Anunnaki were no longer tied to the earth. These words were spoken cautiously, almost silently. Not from fear of punishment, from fear of the void. For the first time, the Sumerians confronted the idea that knowledge might run out. The Anunnaki had been teachers. Not in the sense of schools, in the sense of explaining reality itself. They explained why measures exist, why time is divided, why authority must be limited. Without them, everything became habit without foundation. Nippur held the ancient plans of temples, attributed to the gods. But new temples no longer received heavenly instructions. They were built according to old patterns, copied without full understanding. The city began to repeat itself. And in this repetition arose anxiety. What if the copy gradually becomes error? Some priests began keeping personal records. Not for the temple. Not for the king. For themselves. These tablets were not meant for storage. They were an attempt to capture doubt. They contained no direct accusation of the gods. Only questions. Why are the omens silent? Why do answers delay? Why does the world continue even if the gods do not intervene? The last question was the most dangerous. Because if the world can exist on its own, then the Anunnaki are no longer necessary. And if they are unnecessary, why did they leave so carefully, without destroying anything? These thoughts were not doctrine. They remained internal. The Sumerians were not philosophers as we understand them. But they could sense cracks in the order of things. Nippur at night was a city waiting. Not for the return of gods, for any answer. Even a sign of anger. For anger meant presence. But the nights passed. And apart from the wind, no one responded. It was in this silence that rumors began to spread about tablets that were never found. About texts that supposedly existed but were removed. About knowledge that could not be kept in a temple. They said that somewhere, beneath layers of old buildings, lay unsealed tablets. Unacknowledged. Unrecognized. Tablets where more was said than permitted. No one knew if this was true. But the very fact that people began to believe it spoke of one thing. A city left without teachers began seeking answers beyond what was allowed. And this is where the next, even more unsettling chapter begins. The chapter of tablets that stop mid-sentence. Part 3. The tablets that stop mid-sentence ***. Among the thousands of clay tablets discovered over centuries, some are unlike others. They are not distinguished by size or shape. Their clay is the same as the rest. Their writing confident, practiced. Yet, upon reading them, a strange feeling arises, as if the text stopped not because the thought ended, but because it could not be continued. Sumerian scribes rarely abandoned their work. Even damaged tablets were usually completed. But there exist texts where a line abruptly ends at the point where the most important revelation is expected. When the Anunnaki. And then nothing. No chip. No crack. Just an end. Such tablets were found in Nippur, in Uar, and Lagash. They were not hidden separately. They lay among ordinary texts, as if considered unimportant. Or perhaps their danger was so obvious it required no additional measure. The priests knew about them. In temple archives there existed an unspoken rule: tablets with unfinished formulas were not read aloud. They were not used in training. They were neither destroyed nor discussed. Their presence was acknowledged, their content ignored. Why? Because an unfinished thought could be more dangerous than a completed one. It forced reflection. In some of these texts, the Anunnaki are described not as rulers, but as travelers. A rare phrasing. Usually, gods. Establish, command, confirm. Here, the verb implies movement. Not departure, movement. They came from. And again, an abrupt end. Other tablets feature strange temporal formulas. Not. In those days. Not. In ancient times. But. While they were here. The phrasing implies a limited presence. Not eternity. Not permanence. This contradicted the official view of the gods. Sumerians believed that gods could be angry, distant, silent, but not temporary. Temporality undermined the foundation of rituals. If the gods are guests, then the world does not fully belong to them. This thought could not be allowed openly. Hence the text stopped. Some tablets list gifts brought to the Anunnaki, then abruptly end with, and after this, otherwise. No explanation. No continuation. In another text, it is written about days when measures were changed. What measures? Why? By whom? No answer follows. A modern reader might think the information was lost. But the nature of these abrupt endings is too systematic. They occur exactly where an explanation of transition should be. Transition from one state of the world to another. As if the scribes themselves had no right to record it. Sumerian tradition was strict. Any knowledge had to be confirmed. Supported by ancient sources. But what if the ancient source was the god's departure itself? Such knowledge had no authority. It could not be confirmed. Therefore, it could not be legitimized. Among the priests, there was a silent agreement. Better leave the space empty than fill it with dangerous meaning. These tablets did not teach. They reminded. Of what? Each decided for themselves. Some believed the Anunnaki left because they completed their task. Others, that they were forced to leave. Others, that they left partially. But none of these versions received official status. Because an official version would require rituals. And rituals, action. And action, response. And there was no response. Therefore, the interruption became a form of protection. Ignorance, a form of order. In the quiet of the temples, these tablets lay for centuries. No one erased them. No one completed them. They were accepted as they were. Like scars that do not hurt but remind. It was from these tablets that whispers emerged. Rumors. Suspicions. People began to understand, if something cannot be fully recorded, it is truly important. And then arose an even more troubling question. Who decided that this cannot be written? The answer leads us to those who guarded knowledge. To the priests who knew more than they spoke. And to the fear that made silence part of tradition. This is the subject of the next chapter. Part 4. The fear of knowledge. Why the priests were silent ***. Sumerian priests were not secret keepers in the usual sense. They did not conceal knowledge for power, nor guard it out of greed. Their task was different: to preserve the stability of the world. And sometimes, this required not speaking. In Sumerian understanding, knowledge was not neutral. It carried weight. Consequences. It could alter the order if spoken at the wrong time or to the wrong person. Not all knowledge was considered a blessing. The priests believed, if the world holds together, it means not everything is lost. And if the truth is spoken too clearly, the world might unravel. This was the primary fear. The Anunnaki did not vanish as mythical beings. They vanished as a support system. As long as priests could reference them, order remained justified. Laws had a source. Time had a beginning. Authority had confirmation. If it were said plainly, "The gods have left and will not return," what would happen to the world? Sumerians did not believe in abstract human responsibility for order. For them, order was always granted, sustained, permitted. Without a higher allowance, any system was temporary and dangerous. The priests understood that openly acknowledging the Anunnaki's departure would mean the end of the old world, even if the cities and temples still stood. So they chose a different path. They allowed the gods to remain in language, even if absent in reality. They preserved names, formulas, titles. They continued rituals, knowing that a response might never come. It was not deception. It was maintaining form. Within the temples, there existed a tacit division. Young priests learned texts, performed rites, interpreted omens. The elders preserved memory. Not the tablets. Experience. They knew the moment everything changed. Not by date, by sensation. By the day when, after a ritual, the usual response did not occur. When silence became too long. These insights were not transmitted directly. They were conveyed through glances, pauses, shifts in intonation. Through warnings like, "Not all that is known should be written," or, "Sometimes the gods require silence." There were areas in the temple where students were not brought. Not by prohibition, by lack of necessity. There lay tablets that were never read. Their mere presence was enough. The priests feared not the gods' wrath. They feared the void without gods. Because if the Anunnaki had left for good, it meant the world now depended on humans. And this thought was too heavy. Some priests tried to speak. Carefully. By hints. But such words were never recorded. They dissolved into conversations deemed unofficial. And yet knowledge seeped through. In the conversations of craftsmen. In the doubts of scribes. In children's questions, answered too quickly. The priests sensed that keeping silence was becoming harder. The world changed. New generations did not remember the gods as a living presence. For them, the Anunnaki were already part of myth. And myth was safer than truth. Thus, silence became not a weakness, but a survival tool. Not for the priests. For the world. They hoped that if order were maintained long enough, it would become self-sustaining. That laws would act by inertia. That people would adapt to a world without direct divine intervention. Yet the question remained, whispered quietly in temple halls. What if the Anunnaki left not because they wished to, but because they had to? This thought was the most dangerous of all. Because if the gods were subject to something greater, then the world was far more complex than it appeared. And it is this thought that leads us to the next chapter. The chapter of the last traces of the Anunnaki in royal authority. And how the gods departed not from temples, but from human memory itself. Part V. The last traces of the Anunnaki in royal power ***. When the gods stopped speaking directly, it was the kings who felt it first. Not the priests, not the scribes, not the people, but those who sat upon the throne. For in Sumer, royal authority was never inherited simply by birth. It descended. It was granted from above. And if the source of that grant disappeared, the throne felt strangely light. In earlier times, the king could say, "The Anunnaki placed me here." And that was enough. Later, the formula changed. Kingship was granted in ancient times. And later still, simply, I am king. The evolution was almost imperceptible. Yet in it lay the departure of the gods from political life. Sumerian kings continued to bear titles invoking the Anunnaki. They offered sacrifices, built temples, called themselves servants of the gods. But their dreams no longer contained clear guidance. Their decisions were increasingly made without divine confirmation. And responsibility for the consequences was felt for the first time as human, not divine. In older texts, the king is a conduit of the will of heaven. In newer texts, the king is a guardian of order. The difference seems subtle, but it changes everything. While the Anunnaki were present, a king's mistake could be corrected by the gods. Flood, famine, disease, all had a clear explanation in the higher plan. But when intervention ceased, mistakes accumulated. Kings began to fear the silence. In Nippur, there were stories of rulers offering ever greater gifts, hoping to elicit a response. Of those who increased rituals, complicated ceremonies, instituted new festivals, not because the gods demanded it, but because no response came. Some kings sincerely believed the Anunnaki were merely testing patience. Others, that the gods observed from afar. But some began to suspect the gods were no longer participating. This thought was lethal for authority. If the Anunnaki no longer confirmed kingship, what sustained it? Force? Tradition? Fear? It was during this period that texts began to emphasize laws. Not as divine decrees, but as systems. Laws were written in greater detail, more rigorously, meticulously. As if they were being made self-sufficient. This was a sign of transition. The king became not a mediator of the gods, but an administrator of the world. Officially, however, this was never acknowledged. In inscriptions, the will of the Anunnaki was still cited. Yet between the lines, it became clear, the king increasingly acted on his own. And increasingly bore the consequences. Some tablets show kings asking the gods for a sign, and receiving none. The tablets do not comment on the silence. They simply record the request. The answer is absent. This silence became part of the record. Some rulers attempted to compensate for the gods' absence by amplifying their own sanctity. They declared themselves chosen, especially close, born by the will of heaven. Yet these formulas sounded increasingly tense. Like justifications. The Anunnaki departed not only from temples. They departed from the structure of authority itself. And when this became clear, priests and kings first confronted a thought no one dared voice aloud. What if the world is no longer governed from above? This thought did not spark revolution. It became a slow erosion. Authority persisted. Temples stood. Rituals continued. Yet inside it all grew a new condition, uncertainty. And this uncertainty prepared the ground for the next stage. When the gods began to disappear not from authority, but from human memory itself. The next chapter tells of how the Anunnaki transformed from living presence into legend, and why this was inevitable. Part 6. When gods became legend ***. The transition from presence to memory does not happen suddenly. It stretches across time, nearly imperceptible to those living within it. People continued to speak the names of the gods, to pray, to carve their symbols in clay, yet they no longer expected an answer as they once did. This is how the Anunnaki began to vanish completely. In the early centuries, Sumerians spoke of gods as forces nearby. They could be felt in the city, in the temple, in nature. Their will was read in omens, dreams, and unusual events. Gradually, however, the language changed. The Anunnaki became beings who once existed. Scribes began using the past tense. At first rarely, cautiously, as if by mistake. Then more frequently. This was not a declaration. It reflected an internal sense. The gods no longer act in the present. Stories of encounters with the Anunnaki changed tone. Once recorded as testimony, they became legend. Told to children, to students, to the newly initiated, but without confidence that such encounters could happen again. Myth became a safe form of memory. A myth requires no confirmation. A myth asks no questions. A myth does not impose responsibility. When a god is alive, their departure is frightening. When a god is legend, absence seems natural. Temples still preserved ancient tablets in which the Anunnaki spoke in the first person. But these texts were read as words of a distant past. Honored yet no longer expected to recur. Priests noticed that younger generations perceived the gods differently. For them, the Anunnaki were part of the world's structure, but not its driving force. They explained origins but did not intervene in outcomes. This was a key shift. Before, the gods govern the world. Now, the gods explain why the world is as it is. This distinction is subtle but decisive. The Anunnaki gradually moved from the present into the past, from experience into story. In this form, they could exist indefinitely, without threatening order. New interpretations appeared. The Anunnaki were described as ancestors, as teachers, as those who once came, gave knowledge, and left. They departed not because the world failed, but because their work was complete. This explanation brought comfort. If the gods left, then it was intended. If they do not return, then no return is necessary. Yet within this calm lay a sense of loss. Memory without presence becomes abstract. It loses sharpness. It ceases to influence decisions. People began to debate the gods, reinterpret them, rewrite them, divide and merge their roles. The Anunnaki were no longer a unified experience. They became a topic of discussion. This was the final stage of their departure. When gods become subject to interpretation, they no longer act. When their image depends on debate, they no longer govern. Still, the Sumerians did not see this as the end. For them, it was a transition. The world continued. Laws functioned. Cities thrived. Order persisted. But a question lingered, rarely spoken aloud. What if the Anunnaki left because they could no longer remain? This thought gave rise to a new kind of history, not about gods, but about why they left. Not about deeds, but about consequences. And this is where the next chapter leads. To the possible reasons for the Anunnaki's departure. To what the Sumerians suspected, but never dared record openly. Part 7. Why the Anunnaki left ****. The Sumerians almost never asked this question directly. Not because they did not want to know, but because even posing it was dangerous. To ask, "Why did the gods leave?" was to admit they had left for good. And such an admission could shake the foundation of the world. Thus, the question existed in oblique ways, in speculation, in pauses between lines, in subtle inconsistencies that a careful reader could notice only centuries later. The Anunnaki did not vanish in a single event. There is no story of their departure. No myth of farewell. Their presence simply stops being recorded. As if a chronicler one day set down his stylus and never returned to this topic. Yet the Sumerians left traces of reflection. In some late texts, the gods appear tired. Not wrathful, not punishing, but detached. They no longer intervene directly, acting instead through established laws. A subtle but important shift. Perhaps the Sumerians sensed that the order the Anunnaki had established had reached its limit. It no longer required constant oversight. The world had become too complex to be governed manually. There are tablets that speak of a time of completion. The phrase is unexplained. It simply exists as a fact. Completion of what is not specified. Yet the context hints, the end of an era of direct divine presence. A more troubling theory also existed. The Anunnaki might have left not because the world had become stable, but because their presence had become dangerous. Perhaps the boundary between gods and humans had thinned. Perhaps the knowledge given to humans had shifted the balance. Perhaps humanity had grown too independent. This thought is never expressed directly. But it can be read between the lines in texts emphasizing limits, measures, and restraint. As if someone realized further instruction could destroy the pupil. There are also indirect hints at an external cause. Some myths mention decisions taken above the Anunnaki, councils that are never described, laws to which even gods are subject. If so, the departure of the Anunnaki was not voluntary, but a duty. The execution of a command whose meaning humans were not meant to understand. The Sumerians could not fully accept this idea. It deprived the gods of absoluteness, and with it, the world of simplicity. Hence, instead of answers, they left hints. Enough for later generations to question, but not enough for certainty. This is what creates the sense of mystery. The Anunnaki left as those leave who know their presence is no longer appropriate. Without explanation. Without promise of return. Without a final word. Yet the Sumerians continued to live in the world built by them. They observed laws, measured time, passed on knowledge. Their survival meant one thing: the gods' departure did not destroy the world. But it changed it forever. The next part examines what remained after the Anunnaki. Not temples. Not myths. But what continued to function even after their disappearance. This is the subject of the following chapter. Part 8. What remained after the Anunnaki left ***. When the Anunnaki finally departed, the world continued, yet it was transformed. Not externally, cities stood, canals flowed, temples functioned. The change was internal, in human perception, in the structure of authority, in the sense of time and responsibility. The world became self-sufficient yet fragile. The Sumerians continued to build temples and offer sacrifices. Kings continued to call themselves servants of the gods. Priests performed rituals. But now, their actions were no longer proof of a living god. They were a means to maintain order established long ago. Form was preserved, but the source was absent. Tablets recorded events, but more cautiously. They spoke of outcomes, not divine interventions. The words commanded, established, punished were replaced with "it is known, it is said, thus it was decided." Scribes no longer affirmed the divine will. They described the structure that gods once acted within. Elder priests remembered the old order. They knew how the gods had directly influenced the world, checked kings, affected harvests. This knowledge was passed orally, quietly, almost in whispers. Younger generations heard the stories, but could not verify them. What remained was the sense of something greater, something beyond words. The Sumerians realized that the world could sustain itself. Laws functioned independently. Temples operated without direct divine instruction. Authority passed from king to king by tradition rather than heavenly mandate. Even nature continued its cycles, preordained long ago. But with this came a new awareness of responsibility. Could humans maintain order on their own? Some scribes recorded these reflections in new tablets. They did not name the Anunnaki. They wrote of principles, structure, laws. In this way, the memory of the gods transformed into knowledge of maintaining order without them. Rituals evolved. They kept the form of ancient ceremonies, but their purpose changed. Where once the ritual connected humans to gods, now it became a tool for sustaining internal and societal harmony. The shift was from the divine to the human, from direct oversight to indirect responsibility. Cities thrived. People worked, preserved knowledge of stars, mathematics, agriculture, but all now served humans, not gods. The world became self-organizing, yet remembered the Anunnaki as teachers, ancestors, as beings who once walked among them. In the quiet nights of Nippur, the air carried echoes of the past. The wind whispered through cracked walls and sand-filled streets, and one could almost hear the old tablets speaking, not with words, but with memory. Not as command, but as the presence of those who once maintained order. What remained after the Anunnaki was memory, ritual, law, and a human sense of responsibility. The world endured, but now it was a human world. And this transformation set the stage for the final chapter. For what remained in the earth, in silence, in secrets never written, yet still felt by anyone listening to the rustle of sand and clay. The final chapter will reveal the ultimate legacy of the Anunnaki. Part 9. Secrets left in the sand ***. The final chapter of the story of the Sumerians and the Anunnaki is about what was left between the lines, in the silence of temples, and among clay tablets, what cannot be written, but can be felt in the heart of Mesopotamia. When the Anunnaki departed, they left not only knowledge, laws, and rituals. They left a void, which the Sumerians learned to perceive as space for thought, fear, and hope. It was a void in which humans first realized that order could exist without direct divine supervision. In the ruins of Nippur, Uar, Lagash, and other cities, thousands of clay tablets survive. They record kings, laws, harvests, and trade. But between the lines is silence. Pauses, breaks in sentences, strange formulas with no explanation of events. This is the trace of the Anunnaki, left not to be understood, but to be felt. The Sumerians adapted to this silence. It became part of their culture, part of how they understood the world. Rituals continued, festivals were celebrated, laws obeyed. Yet inside all of it was conscious memory. The gods had been here, they had observed, taught, and left. But their departure was not destruction, it was a transfer of responsibility. Responsibility became the foundation of order. The world now depended on human action, on adherence to law, on careful use of knowledge, on understanding that wisdom carried consequences. In temple quiet, in the rustle of sand, in the cracks of clay tablets, Sumerian cities preserved the traces of the past. Not as records, but as a sense of what once was. Not as instruction, but as a reminder that the world had been held in the hands of beings now gone. The Anunnaki did not vanish entirely. They left a trace, indirect, interpretable, never fully knowable. A trace that taught, knowledge and order can be maintained without those who once held the world in their hands. And this is the ultimate secret of Sumer. The world can exist without gods, yet the memory of them preserves structure, caution, and reverence for the unseen. The void after the gods became space for humanity, for reflection, for responsibility, for creation. The Sumerians lived on, building a civilization that preserved the wisdom of the Anunnaki, yet acted without them. This wisdom, hidden in the silence of tablets and crumbled temples, has survived millennia, a lesson that the greatness of a world is measured not only by the forces that created it, but by those who remain to uphold it. And thus ends the story, left to us not in words, but in memory between the lines. Part X. The Unspoken Legacy ***. Even after the Anunnaki faded into legend, their influence remained embedded in the foundations of human civilization. Not as direct guidance, not as intervention, but as a framework for understanding the world. Laws, measurements, timekeeping, agriculture, mathematics, all the systems they left behind continued to function. Humanity inherited not only knowledge, but the responsibility to sustain it. The Sumerians understood that civilization is not given, it must be maintained. And the Anunnaki, in leaving, had created a test. Could humans uphold the order they had set? Could they act without direct oversight and still preserve balance? Temples, which once resonated with divine presence, now echoed only human voices. Rituals, originally designed to communicate with gods, became tools for community, cohesion, and the reinforcement of social order. Knowledge that was once sacred guidance transformed into human wisdom. Memory of the Anunnaki was preserved in stories, myths, and records, but it was increasingly interpreted, debated, and transformed. They became teachers who had departed, leaving behind lessons not always explicit but encoded in the structures and practices of society. Silence itself became part of the legacy. The unrecorded truths, the pauses in tablets, the gaps in knowledge, all shaped the consciousness of the Sumerians. They learned to live with absence, to act responsibly without constant confirmation, and to respect the unseen order that had once been directly governed by divine beings. Through centuries, this legacy guided humanity's first steps toward autonomy. The Sumerians carried it forward, ensuring that the principles of organization, law, and harmony endured even in the absence of the gods who had created them. And in the quiet moments, when the wind moved through the ruins of Nippur or the dust settled on a clay tablet, one could almost feel the lingering presence of the Anunnaki. Not as rulers, not as active participants, but as the architects of human responsibility, who once held the world in their hands and left it for humans to sustain. Thus, the ultimate lesson of the Sumerians and the Anunnaki is clear: civilization is not divine gift alone. It is the enduring effort of those who remain, humans learning to carry the weight of knowledge, order, and memory in the silent spaces left by departed gods. The story concludes here, but its echoes persist in every law, ritual, and record that survived millennia, a quiet testament to the bridge between gods and humanity, and to the enduring power of memory itself.